Hey everyone, want to welcome you to our program. If you have a Bible or Bible app, go ahead and get that out with me. We're going to be over in Psalm 35. Psalm 35, our intention in all of this is for us to read the text, for us to study Psalm 35, and then for us to have something to be able to meditate on, for us to be able to focus on. So I want to encourage you to follow along with me. It'd be best if you can do that. But if you can't, I understand. Some of you are at work. Some of you are kind of finishing up your day. But we're going to be in Psalm 35, which is a psalm of lament. It is an imprecatory psalm, meaning that it's violent or it's cursing. It's the idea of that they are requesting divine intervention against unjust enemies. And so it's this idea that they are pleading for God's judgment, God's cursing, God's destruction to come upon them. We saw that back in Psalm 7. We saw that we're going to see this in this Psalm, Psalm 58, 59, Psalm 109, Psalm 137. But this Psalm, when we look at this Psalm, it's broke down into three different stanzas, kind of alternating between a request for protection and a vow of praise. And so in verses 1 through 10, we have this cry for God to act as a warrior against his attackers. In verses 11 through 18, we have this complaint against these false witnesses, these people who were falsely his friends. And in verses 19 to 28, we have an appeal for justice, vindication, and an ultimate promise of praise. So here's what I want you to know. And here's the things that we know and don't know about this psalm. Well, first off, this is a psalm of David, King David, a man who had many enemies throughout his life. Whether you think about bears and lions, Goliath, you think about King Saul and his enemies or his soldiers, you think about the Philistines, the Moabites, the Amalekites, you think about Absalom, his very son. And so that's what we know, but what we don't know is we have no idea what circumstances are surrounding the time that David is writing this. Some have suggested this probably was written during the time which Saul was chasing him throughout the countryside, and David was on a run as a fugitive, and David is appealing to God to take care of Saul. But honestly, we really don't know the circumstances. There's not enough information within the text for us to come to that kind of conclusion. But what we know, this is a dark time of David's life. His enemies are attacking him. He's asking God to arise to vindicate him and to deal with his enemies. And we have a lot to cover. We have 22 verses to cover, so I want to encourage you to follow along. We're going to just jump right in and think about what David is writing here. So let's just start. We're going to verses 1 through 10, first stanza, and we'll read that together, and then we'll talk about it. In verse 1, he says, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with those who strive against me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of shield and of buckler. Stand up for my help, and also draw out the spear, and stop those who pursue me. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. Let those be put to shame and brought to dishonor who seek after my life. Let those be turned back and brought to confusion, who plot my hurt. Let them be like chaff before the wind, and let the angel of the Lord chase them. Let their way be dark and slippery, and let the angel of the Lord pursue them. Angel of the Lord pursue them, for without cause they have hidden their net from me in a pit, which they dug without cause for my life. Let destruction come upon him unexpectedly, and let his net that he is hidden catch himself. Into the very destruction let him fall. And my soul shall be joyful in the Lord; it shall rejoice in his salvation. All my bones shall say, Lord, who is like you, delivering the poor from him who is too strong for him, and yes, the poor and the needy from him who plunders him." So look at the beginning here. Look at verse 1 again. He says, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with those who strive against me." And so plead my case here. The Hebrew word is a judicial term. He's saying contend with them, litigate with them, go to law against them. Take them to court, bring a lawsuit against them, set them before the judge, put them on the stand, read the charges, advocate for me, defend me against these accusers, plead my case, Lord. And yet David is not asking God to be his personal lawyer. This is not a personal vengeance case. Think about it. with the exception of a few times in David's life, he lived for God to the extent that when somebody came and was attacking David, they were actually attacking God. When somebody made themselves an enemy of David, they were making themselves an enemy of God. Now, there were those who set themselves up against David. In doing so, they had set themselves up against the Lord. They had made themselves an enemy of the Lord. And notice what he says next. He says, fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of your shield, your buckler. Stand up for me, for my help. Also draw out the spear and stop those who pursue me. We go from the courtroom we go to the battlefield. And so these charges are going to be read on the battlefield. And notice, fight against them. And David is calling God to the battlefield as a warrior to be at war against those who are fighting against him. Really, David is calling God to get ready, to put his armor on. Take up your shield, which would have been a larger shield that maybe would have been held by some kind of like a sword bearer or something like that. Your buckler, which is a smaller shield. The idea is defend me. Draw your spear, unsheathe your sword, defend me, O God. Does God have armor? Well, of course he does. Before God told us to take up the armor of God, as Ephesians 6 says, we find in Isaiah 59 that Jesus took up the very same armor to go against his enemies. Remember, the word of the Lord is sharper than a two-edged sword. God has weapons. God has protection. God is often described as a warrior in Scripture. In Exodus chapter 15, in Isaiah 42, in Psalm 24, in Zephaniah chapter 3, we see that God is like a warrior. He's ready to defend his people. He's ready to fight on their behalf. And so David is calling God into action. Defensively and offensively, he's saying, fight them, stand up, take your shield, draw out your spear, help me, stop them, defend me. And notice the last verse that he says there in verses 3, he says, say to my soul, I am your salvation. See, David needed to hear it. He needed to be reminded over and over and over again. But David needed not just to hear it with his ears. David needed to hear this deep down in his soul. Like, this needed to become a part of who David is. See, David realized that no other place could he find salvation than God. Not himself, not his own army, not some military leader that he had, not some other nation, not some political alliance, not some politician, but God is his salvation. I think what's really interesting, from verses 4 down to verse 8, we have this cry out for vengeance, this idea of vindication. He's crying out for God to curse his enemies. And I want you to notice as you go through here, in verse 4, he says, let those be put to shame. In verse 5, let them be like chaff. In verse 6, he says, let their way be dark and slippery. In verse 8, let destruction come upon them. And so let me. And so look at the language that he uses. Look at some of the things that he asks God for, that he put them to shame and bring them to dishonor. Bring them low, humble them. Expose them for who they are and for what they're doing. Let their crafty plotters be brought to confusion. They think they're so crafty. They think I don't know what they're doing. Confuse them. Make them rethink their attacks. He says, make them like chaff. Make them like nothing, Lord. Expose their lack of substance. Like, blow them away, Lord, One thing he says is have your angel chase them. And he says that twice. Send your messenger. Chase them down. Pursue them. Judge them, O Lord. Then he says, make their way dark and slippery. The idea is frustrate their way, make their way difficult, make their attacks more difficult on them. Then he says, let their traps come upon them. Cause the very nets that they've hidden from me, thinking they're going to trap me in, come back on them. Let them get caught up in their own nets. Cause them to fail, fall into destruction. Let it happen suddenly. Think about Haman. Haman got hung by his own gallows. Think about Daniel's accusers. They got thrown into the lion's den that they had hoped to put Daniel in, which he did go in, but God protected him. Think about King Saul. He would have been snared by his own jealousy towards David. And so think about it. If this were David, if this was during the time which David was writing this, was the time where he was running as a fugitive throughout the countryside, then think about how this came back on Saul. Saul tried to control the circumstance, but he lost control of himself. He tried to eliminate David, but ended up eliminating really his own future. Saul tried setting an external trap for David, but ended up getting caught up in this internal trap of jealousy and madness, and it all led to his downfall. But notice something that David said in this text. He says, they did it without cause. See, David was innocent. And think about it. David wasn't always a perfect man. He wasn't always innocent. There were times in David's life where he was not innocent, that he was the guilty man. Like when Nathan came before him and said, you're the man. He said, I have sinned. He was a sinner just like a lot of us are. But David was innocent here. He didn't do it. And these people were attacking David without any cause. He didn't deserve it. And David is asking God to protect and fight for him, to vindicate him. And that's what God does. God is a just God. God cares about the innocent, and he protects them, those who are being mistreated. In verses 9 through 10, look at the promise of praise that he gives here. David goes from asking for justice to be done for his enemies to expressing praise for God's vindication. He would be joyful, not just with his mouth, but he says he was going to be joyful with his own soul, his entire being. Deep, deep down inside of him, he was going to be thankful to God, and he was going to rejoice in his salvation. And he would express that joy, not just with his mouth, but he says his bones would express it. He would say, who is like you, Lord? No one else really cares about the needy, about the poor. But God, you care about them, and you take care of their oppressors. Again, God protects. He fights for those who are innocent, those who are helpless. Look at the second stanza here in verses 11 through 18. Let's read that together. Begin in verse 11. He says, fierce witnesses rise up. They ask me things I do not know. They reward me evil for good, to the sorrow of my soul. But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled myself with fasting. My prayer would return to my own heart. I paced about as though he were my own friend or my brother. I bowed down heavily as to one who mourns for his mother. But in my adversity, they rejoice and gather together. Attackers gather against me. They tore at me and did not cease. With ungodly mockers at feast, they gnash at me with their teeth. Lord, how long will you look? Will you look on? Rescue me from their destructions, my precious life from the lions. I give you thanks in the great assembly, and I will praise you amongst many people. Let's stop there. Let's back up to verse 11. Let's think about what he's saying here. David is dealing with these false witnesses. They're accusing him of things that he didn't do. And notice what he says. They rewarded evil for good. They gave him evil even though he had promised them good, which only would have caused David to be, have deep grief within the situation. Notice in verses 13 and 14, David did good for them. Like when they were sick, he mourned, he fasted, he prayed for them. He was worried about their pain and their suffering. He paced back and forth like they were his own friend or they were his own brother. He kneeled down heavily as if he was mourning his own mother. And he loved them. He cared about them. He prayed for them with heaviness on his heart. And so in verses 15 and 16, even though David did good for them, yet look at what they did for David. They rejoiced in his adversity. They gathered against him behind his back in secret. They stabbed him in the back. It's one thing to say something and do something like that to someone's face, but it's another thing to attack them from behind. And so they tore him into pieces with scoffs and reproaches and curses, and they didn't stop. They just kept doing it. He says they gnashed at him with rage and hatred against him. Then in verses 17 and 18, David turns to God and he cries out. Look at the first thing he says, Lord, how long will you look on? See, remember David had called God to action. Stand up, fight against them, fight for me, stop them. But David thought that God wasn't doing enough, that God was just going to sit back and watch. Lord, when are you going to do anything about this? Lord, why haven't you done anything? Lord, stand up, take up your armor. Look what he goes on to say, rescue me from their destructions, my precious life from the lions. See, David is distressed. David felt like lions were surrounding him, prowling lions, and they were seeking to devour him. And David says, when you rescue me, I'll give thanks in the great assembly. I'll praise you amongst many people. Not only would he pray, be thankful and praise God, but David says, I'm going to do it out in the open. I'm going to go into the great assembly and give thanks for everybody to hear. I'm going to walk amongst your people before everybody, and I'll be singing your praises so everybody will know that you are my salvation, Lord. Look at the final stanza in verses 19 to the end of the chapter. Let's to the end of the psalm. Let's go ahead and read it. He says, let them not rejoice over me who are wrongfully my enemies, nor let them wink with their eye who hate me without cause. For they do not speak peace, and they despise deceitful matters. Against the quiet ones in the land, they also open up their mouths wide against me and say, aha, our eyes have seen it. This you have seen, O Lord. Do not keep silent. O Lord, do not be far from me. Stir up yourself and awake to my vindication, to my cause, my God and my Lord. Vindicate me, O Lord, my God, according to your righteousness, and let them not rejoice over me. Let them not say in their hearts, so we would have it. And let them not say, we have swallowed him up. Let them be ashamed and brought to mutual confusion, who rejoice at my hurt. Let them be clothed with shame and dishonor, who exalt themselves against me. He says, let them shout for joy and be glad, who favor my righteous cause. Let them say continually, let the Lord be magnified, who has pleasure in the prosperity of his servant. And my tongue shall speak of your righteousness and of your praise all the day long. Now go back to verse 19 again. He says, let them not rejoice over me who are wrongfully my enemies, nor let them wink with the eye who hate me without cause. These people are his enemies. They've wronged him. They've attacked him without cause. He says, don't let them win. Don't let them get the last laugh. Don't let them wink as if they've done something here. Don't let them rejoice over me as though they've won already. They've overpowered me. He says, for they do not speak peace. They're the ones speaking the violence. They're the ones who are plotting. They're devising secretly against the humble, quiet people. They're opening their mouth wide against David, saying, our eyes have seen it. We've seen his downfall. We're watching him fall before our very eyes. He says, Lord, you've seen this, so don't keep silent. Don't be far from me. Think about the contrast in the text. Think about what they think they've seen versus what God has actually seen. They think they've seen David's fall, but he says, you've seen what they've done, Lord. You know who they are and what they've done. Think about the contrast between the way that they use their mouths. He says his enemies have opened their mouths wide against him. They've said all kinds of things of hatred and rebuke. And he says, I can't afford you, Lord, to keep your mouth closed. So don't keep silent. Give a defense. Plead my case, read the charges, advocate for me, defend me against their accusations. Think about another contrast. Maybe it's a little pushing it a little bit, but his enemies have met in secret. They didn't do it to his face. They did it behind his back. They plotted and they attacked him from behind. But he says, God, don't be far from me. Don't distance yourself. Don't leave me like they have. Don't turn your back on me, but forever before me. And maybe that's a stretch a little bit, but I think that's part of what David's saying. Then in verses 23 to 26, he says, stir up yourselves and wake to my vindication, to my cause, my God and my Lord. Vindicate me, O Lord. According to your righteousness, let them not rejoice over me. No, think back to verse 1. He says, stand up, Lord, for my cause. And now he's saying, stir yourself up, wake up. He's calling God to action again. He thinks God is just too passive in all of this. Now think back to verse 1. David said, plead my case. And now he's saying, wake up to my vindication, to my cause. There's no longer a time for them to be in court. Now we need justice. There's a time for action. There's a time for vindication. In fact, he says, vindicate me, O Lord my God. Clear my name. Show them that I'm innocent. Let them not rejoice over me, but let them, and he says 3 ways that God can vindicate them. Notice in verse 25, let them. Verse 26, let them. Now in verse 27, there's a shift, but he says, let them. And in the last part of verse 27, he says, let the Lord. He says there's something the Lord needs to do. So look at verse 25 to 26. He said, let them not say in their hearts, we've done what we wanted. We've swallowed them up. Don't let them have the pleasure of it. Don't let them do it, Lord. Don't let them overcome me. But instead he says, let them be ashamed and confused. For they rejoice in my hurt. But instead let them wear shame and dishonor. Let it be on them, O Lord, not upon me. Let me ask you this. Was it right for David to pray for this? To pray for vindication here? Was it right for David to pray for God to come against his enemies? And I think the answer is yes. Like vindication and vengeance belongs to God. And I think it's right for us to put retribution in God's hands. I think it's right for us to go to God and trust in him and let him do the punishing instead of taking that on ourselves and trying to punish people. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22, he's talking about Jesus. And he says, even though Jesus committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth, Jesus was 100% innocent in all that they accused him of. He says, who when he was reviled didn't revile in return. When he suffered, he didn't threaten. But it says he committed himself to him who judges righteously. He says, God, I'm going to put this in your hands, and I know you're going to work all this out. In fact, it's interesting that he even prayed for his enemies. Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He wanted them to be forgiven. He was dying so that they would be forgiven. Look in the last few verses here, verses 27 and 28. There's a shift in the text. David goes from pleading with God to deal with his enemies, praying for vindication, to looking over God's people and praying for them instead. Listen to what he says. Let them shout for joy and be glad, who favor my righteous cause, and let them say continually, let the Lord be magnified, who has pleasure in the prosperity of his servant. He says, and my tongue shall speak of your righteousness and of your praise all day long. So notice he says, let them, but this time he says, let them shout for joy, let them be glad, and let them say, magnify the Lord. I want to make God bigger in my struggle, and I want you to make God bigger for other people as well. Why? Because they favor his righteous cause. They rejoice in the prosperity of God's servant like David. And again, David promises to use his mouth, his tongue, to praise and to speak about God. And so that he will speak about God's righteousness, that he will praise him all day long because God delivered him. God awoke to his vindication, to action. God pleaded David's case, and God vindicated him, and he protected him, and he rose up like a soldier, a warrior, to take on the enemies of David, who were his enemies. There's a lot in this text for us to really consider. There's a lot for us to think about. So I want to encourage you, please don't put your Bible down. I'm sure I overlooked tons of things throughout the text, but my encouragement to you is to pick it up throughout your day today, throughout the rest of your day, and to pick it up maybe tomorrow and really give some thought to what David's saying here in the text. I appreciate your time, appreciate your attention. Glad that you joined us here. Want to encourage you, if you have any questions or any comments, please make sure to comment down in the comment section. I'll be able to respond back and forth with you. But appreciate you. Hope you have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend ahead of you. Hope everybody has a great day, rest of their day. God bless everybody.